Hello. Hello and welcome to Spare Change News TV. My name is Sam Baltrusis. I'm the editor-in-chief of Spare Change News. Joining me today is Liam Greenwell.
Nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
Welcome to Spare Change News TV. Liam is one of our interns. He's also a reporter. And it's exciting to work with Liam because he is sort of like, when I was in high school, I was definitely an up-and-coming journalist, so it's kind of great to see the younger generations getting involved. So Liam, how did you get involved with Spare Change?
So I've been involved with my school newspaper at Cambridge Ringe Latin School, which is a public high school here in Cambridge, since freshman year.
Yep.
And I was working on articles freshman and sophomore year. I got more and more involved in layout and in the editorial process. And junior year, I was editor-in-chief. And so then over the summer, I was looking for some way to help out with Spare Change. I had been familiar with them from, all over Boston, and I was wondering if there was some way I could help out with the organization.
So what led you to journalism specifically? Like, was it a calling, or like what led you to write stories and to report and be an editor?
I've always written stuff, whether it's, stupid little short stories in first grade or, but I think for journalism, it was really, at my school, I was reading the newspaper, and about halfway through freshman year, I decided, this is something that I want to look into. And then, as I got more and more involved, I became more and more interested in it.
Now, when I was your age, I was kind of like finding my voice. Like, do you feel that you've had, tell me about the journalism program at CRLS. Mm-hmm. Is it a strong program there, or?
Yeah, it's definitely a strong program. So we have 2 journalism classes. So we have Journalism 1 and Journalism 2. And I never took Journalism 1 because I was involved with the club, but that's more like an introductory course, basics of reporting and stuff like that. And then Journalism 2 is becoming an editor and laying out the paper. And then there's the club separate from that. And so even if you're not taking the classes, you can still write articles and become involved in the production of the paper.
Now, why Spare Change News specifically? Was this something that did you read an issue and that you identified with it, or like what led you to Spare Change?
That's a good question. I think I had always seen them. I'd always bought them, and I felt passionate about the issues. I didn't really. I knew some about homelessness, but I didn't know a whole lot about homelessness, and it was something that I felt needed more coverage in the media.
Yeah.
And so I really identified with the mission of Spare Change, and so I just wanted to get more involved.
What's really good about being an intern / reporter for Spare Change, this is the beginnings for a lot of great careers. Like, you see former journalists who came into Spare Change, they wrote their first story, got their first published clip, and they go off to work for the Globe, or they go off to work for bigger publications. And not to say that we're not a bigger publication, but we're a street newspaper, very grassroots. But you've actually had several stories published already in Spare Change, which is huge for someone at his part of your career. Mm-hmm. And if you had an internship, say at like the Globe or elsewhere, you probably would not get any clips. Right. So it's really good to work with younger journalists and also to sort of get the different perspective. What I find so fascinating about you too is sort of when you're learning about journalism, does online and multimedia is it part of your education?
Not so much at school. We actually still don't really have a website for the Register Forum, which is the paper. But that's really number one on our priorities right now. And so, and unquestionably, we still have a Facebook, we still have a Twitter, and all that. Unquestionably, social media and an online presence is imperative to be a thriving publication today, I think.
Yeah.
It's a little bit different for the high school paper because our audience is pretty limited to the school, and so if we can pass out the papers to the school, but I think for wider audiences, having an online presence, I feel, that 90% of what I read is probably, besides, for news, is online.
That's interesting, because I feel like that is that is what's happening. I mean, people
Yeah.
are getting their news online, and
Right.
so how do we? Because I'm also a journalism instructor. How do we reach out to people who get their news online and
Right.
also have a print product as well?
Right.
And so I mean, I think we're both like your high school's doing it, and Spare Change is doing it as well. But I think that as we're getting further and further as the media landscape changes more and more, we have to really embrace online and learn how to monetize online too.
Yeah. I mean, with everything from from Twitter to an online article, everything is becoming much more bite-sized, right?
Yeah.
And people's attention spans are shortening because they're not sitting down and reading the paper at the breakfast table anymore, right? And so, it's really a question of how do you take advantage of that, but also work through the negatives inherent in the medium, I think.
Well, I find it so really like interesting now versus when I was in your age in high school and in college is we didn't have online when I was learning. So I learned the old school techniques. Do you guys learn like when you're laying out like what's the technique with laying out your paper and sort of the techniques of reporting?
So we lay out our paper using InDesign is all on the computer, and that hasn't really changed too much over the past few years, just because you're always basically doing the same things when you're laying out a paper. But I mean it's rare that you'll see someone encourage someone to just cold call someone. Usually there's some sort of emailing or like Twitter involved. For example, I'm starting to work on a piece for Spare Change about the Y2Y Shelter in Harvard Square.
Right.
And they just sort of dodged a bullet by getting $2 million back in the budget to combat youth homelessness.
Yeah.
And the reason I found out about that, and the reason I'm pursuing the story, is I saw something on Twitter about it.
That's interesting. Is like I remember when I was starting out as a reporter. First of all, like when we did our newspaper, it was literally when I went to Boston University. It was literally cut and paste. So we printed out the stories. We had boards, and we put all the copy on the boards and laid it out like very old school with glue. We had glue. But things have changed a lot, and I when we started having computers, I sound like I'm like ancient or something. When we started having computers, we actually do research and find story ideas. And what I think now is I think that we've learned how to use Twitter and Facebook as a tool to lead us for story ideas.
Right.
So I think it's a great way to do that. Now, when you so you talked about the Y2Y Shelter, tell us a little bit about what that is and sort of like what the latest is with the Y2Y Shelter in Harvard Square.
Yeah, definitely. So so there are some Harvard students, or actually they graduated last year, I think, and they are trying to start this shelter that's focused. It's called the Youth to Youth Shelter. It's in Harvard Square. Or it will be, and it's focused on providing services and beds to, I think, like 18 to 24-year-olds, because it's a population that gets often ignored.
Absolutely, yep.
Because if kids age out of the foster care system, or if they're no longer, part of a family unit, or they feel uncomfortable going into like an adult shelter, it's a very vulnerable population. And so this is trying to focus directly on that population and provide youth-to-youth support. Yeah.
Well, I mean, you hit the nail on the head. I mean, like basically, so there's a population that's between 18 and 24 that have been marginalized. A lot of them were part of the foster care system, and they aged out of the foster care system. Some of them are LGBT, some of them are trans. There's a whole population out there that are underserved, that are kind of the forgotten ones. And I'm friends with some of them. Like one of our vendors who is advocating for the Y2Y Shelter, literally from the streets. He's in Harvard Square on the streets advocating for the shelter. And like during the winter, and seeing him out on the streets and unsheltered, it is definitely it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking that they're kind of forgotten about it. He was part of the foster care system. His name's John, and he now is at Bridge Over Troubled Waters, and hopefully going to end up at Y2Y, which is slotted to open up in November. The shelter is going to be at the First Parish Church, which is on Church Street in Harvard Square. and it's a beautiful space, and I hope that it
Yeah.
works out for them. I know that you haven't interviewed them yet,
Right, yeah.
but so tell me about there's like the funding that they were worried about.
Yeah. So earlier this year, there was a recommended $2 million to be put into youth to combat youth homelessness, and this was great news for places like the Y2Y Shelter. It wasn't all guaranteed to go to the Y2Y Shelter, of course, but this was new funding. This was, as we talked about, a population that doesn't get a lot of funding. And so this was great news, and this was funding that the Y2Y Shelter was relying on a lot. And so then, just about a week ago, Charlie Baker vetoed the $2 million. And so this was terrible news, because that eliminates a lot of the funding that the Y2Y Shelter was counting on. But luckily, because a lot of people called their legislators and a lot of people, reached out to the Y2Y Shelter to donate and talk to government officials, that $2 million has recently been reinstated. And so that'll be what the article's about. It'll be about the Y2Y Shelter in general, sort of checking in on them. Construction's supposed to start next week sometime, because they're transforming the space. But then also about this reinstated $2 million. That was sort of a sigh of relief.
Well, do we have any idea why Governor Charlie Baker vetoed the $2 million?
Well, he has talked a lot about combating homelessness, but it's still early in his tenure, and he's really focused on some other aspects of homelessness, like chronic homelessness, like Marty Walsh, or family homelessness too.
Yeah.
So this is sort of a weird gray area that doesn't really get a lot of support. Maybe not politically popular. No one really knows why Baker vetoed it, but you can guess that it probably has something to do with keeping a sense of conservative budget, cutting the fat from the budget or something like that.
Yeah, well, I mean, the bottom line is like the 18 to 24 that Y2Y Shelter is advocating for, giving actual beds to, doesn't fit in with the family homelessness part, which also is a huge problem. And you wrote about that as well. So tell me about you did a story on family homelessness. There was a 25% spike in homeless families, which is huge. So tell me, what did you find out about family homelessness when you did the story for the last edition of Spare Change?
Yeah, so this was from the 35th annual homeless census by the Boston Public Health Commission. And it's an annual census. It's a point-in-time census that they do every winter. And I think chronic homelessness rose like 9%. But the real surprise from this past census was that family homelessness rose about 25%, from 1,234 households to 1,543 this year.
That's a huge increase.
Yeah. And so one of the organizations that's really working to try to combat this is Family Aid. And they've been in partnership with the City of Boston for about 20 years. They're the largest provider of emergency care services to families in the City of Boston. Actually, that's worth mentioning too, that these numbers are just in the City of Boston. It's not the metro area, it's just the city. And so Family Aid, also as sort of a sign of the times, they have a program where they provide emergency assistance. And they'd never, in the 20 years that this program has been around, they've never had to start a wait list. And this year they had to start a wait list, and there were over 30 households on it.
Wow.
So, there are a lot of theories about why this is happening now, but it's unquestionably a huge problem, and it's a growing problem.
Well, just to kind of give you some, so we know October 8th is the Long Island shelter close. There's been a lot of, what happened is that the families during the winter was our worst winter on record. It was so bad. And a lot of the homeless families were put into hotels.
Right.
So the hotels are sort of like a temporary shelter. It's like a Band-Aid solution to these homeless families. So my theory is it's related to that. Because like some of those hotels, because of safety issues or various other issues, are also, that the state wasn't paying for it.
Right.
Like they were racking up these huge like multi-million-dollar bills from the hotels that these homeless families are staying at, and they're not paying it.
Right.
So what happens to the families when the money runs out,
Right.
and what happens to the families when they get kicked out of the hotels for non-payment? And so it's a lot going on here, guys, and it's affecting families. And it's also affecting the younger population that's above, the kids. So we have like the 18 to 24. Generally, like there's problems throughout every age group, and there are people that are homeless, all walks of life. There's usually a major event, like with the homeless families, having come from a situation where my mom divorced my dad, and we didn't have anywhere to go. So it's something that, like things like divorce, it could be avoiding an abusive situation,
Right.
The various things like husband loses his job, and they have nowhere to go. So this is a crisis. We're in a crisis mode. We're going to talk to Richard Ring, who is the executive director of Family Aid, next Monday. So make sure you watch the show 5:30 every Monday on Channel 9 on CCTV. And then so the family homelessness. So like, what was the response that you got for this story that we published this last edition of Spare Change?
So, I think family homelessness is often ignored, right? There was the big plan by Mayor Marty Walsh to combat veteran and chronic homelessness, but that pretty much ignores family homelessness.
Right.
And so a lot of what I got was, it really shows how almost undercover this issue is, right? It's not being talked about on the political stage. And, embedded in these statistics is something else, too, because even though they don't count in the 1,500 families that were homeless at the time of the census, there's a lot of families that are sort of on the edge. And if someone loses their job or something bad happens, like you said, then that can really become an emergency situation. In the lower rung, I was talking to Vincent Flanagan last week, who's leaving as executive director, and he was saying that in the lower rung of the social ladder, people have about 9 days of income before everything's gone if they lose their job, if something bad happens.
Well, just kind of give you this insight. So, kind of alluding to what. So, Vincent Flanagan is our executive director. He was on Spare Change News TV last week. He definitely, like, he's an advocate for empowerment, empowering the community. A lot of the families, some of them are still working. So you have homeless families that get priced out of their homes, which is very common because our rents are going way up, and we have families who are the working poor who cannot afford their rents, and even though that they're working, it could be a minimum wage job, and they still can't afford their rent, and they're homeless. So that's increasing. Also with the census, so it's a point in time census, and point in time is where they go out in the field one night. We've been very critical of the census because we feel like it's not accurate. So if we're 20% to 25% spike in family homelessness, I believe that it's much higher, because it's very difficult to actually get the exact numbers. Right. And when I saw the census, the point in time data, I was flabbergasted. I'm like, I cannot believe how bad it is on this, and so that means that this is just the tip of the iceberg of what we got from this report. So thank you for covering it. Yeah. Richard Ring, who's coming on the show next week, he's the executive director of Family Aid, was very congratulatory to your article. And he said that it was important to him and to his organization that we focused on family homelessness, which is what Spare Change News does. Right. We're big about focusing on the stories that no one else really wants to talk about. Yeah. And so speaking of that, so you did a profile on Vincent Flanagan. Yeah. And he is our outgoing executive director. What did he say? So he talked about the liquid assets. What did he say about sort of his job as executive director of Spare Change?
So a lot of what he talked about was, in the early days, it was hard to, or it's always hard to secure funding. It's a constant struggle. It's something that every organization has to go through every year. Vincent's done a great job at Spare Change. $16,000 more than expected last year. But the thing is, every year you start over, right? And so then you have to make that money again. So it's not. So he's done a great job, but unfortunately, it doesn't really carry over to the next executive director. And so a lot, and then he talked a lot about why Spare Change News is important as an organization, right? And so, as you just talked about, Spare Change News covers stories that the mainstream media doesn't really cover, or goes more in depth. Has a very concrete focus on issues of homelessness,
social justice related issues
right.
too.
And it also provides for the vendors a real opportunity to have a job, even if because for most jobs they require background checks or drug tests or things that may disqualify people or
an address. I mean,
an address. Right,
yeah, like the biggest thing with our vendors who coming in, they can't get other jobs. You walk down the street and you hear people say to homeless people, "Get a job." Well, our vendors have a job. They're selling Spare Change News,
right.
and in some cases, the only job they can get was being a vendor of Spare Change because they didn't have an address.
Right.
And Vincent talked also a little bit about the Homeless Bill of Rights, and we were actually publishing part of his testimony. He went to the assembly on last Tuesday at the State House to advocate for the Homeless Bill of Rights. And the Homeless Bill of Rights will protect the homeless population for not having an address or being sort of disqualified because of their status. Because there definitely is their marginalization. If you have your resume and you have all these jobs and you're missing 3 years of work because of a life, like you get in a car accident or something horrible happens and you become homeless, they rarely get hired.
Right.
And the Homeless Bill of Rights will protect these people. And everyone deserves a second chance. And I think things happen in life, that are out of our control. And it's our duty as citizens to pick our people up. If they're fallen and they need help, to give them a hand up and not a handout. And and I think by just writing about these issues, I think it educates our readers and it educates people. And I also think that Spare Change is just it's a good publication. It's like it's a good read. So kind of having read Spare Change and then coming in and being a part of it, what were some of your misconceptions coming in, and how have those misconceptions changed?
I don't know. Let's see. So I guess whenever you see a publication. And then sort of go behind the scenes. It's always interesting to see how people actually write their stories and how it all gets done. It's a really small team at Spare Change for the most part, and so it's really comforting to know that these people are out there working their butts off to make this happen every other week. And when you have the paper in your hands, it can, you can say, all these people are working on it. It's not really something I need to focus on. But, when you're actually, sort of behind the scenes and you see, wow, all these people are, it's only a few people, but, they're really devoting their lives to it. It can be really inspiring. And, it can make you realize that advocacy work and advocacy journalism really needs more people to do it and is really important, too.
Good answer. That is exactly what it is. I mean, it's a very, very grassroots. And he mentioned before about funding. I mean, obviously funding, buying the paper helps out the vendors, and it also helps us out indirectly. But extremely grassroots. You can also donate directly to Spare Change News and the Homeless Empowerment Project on our website, sparechangenews.net. I'm looking into other ways to raise money because I think that we need operational costs because we don't really we have very little money to actually make the paper. And I have big dreams to make this like the best street newspaper in the world. But because I think we have a great team, and I think that we have amazing vendors, and it's really what makes Spare Change News so special is the paper is definitely better, but I think the vendors are special too. Yeah, and a lot of them have been with the organization for 20 years, and this is the oldest continuously operated street newspaper in the country. We are having come back from Seattle at the International Network of Street Newspapers. We definitely have a great reputation across the world. And this show was what debuted at the convention, the summit, and we got really strong response. And I'm actually talking with a group in Ireland. We're talking to possibly not syndicate the show, but have other street newspapers do a show like this to promote their paper, because this has been a great vehicle to promote Spare Change News in a different way and to reach new people who normally don't read Spare Change. So one of my goals is to reach out to the younger population. And what can I do as editor of Spare Change to reach out to you?
I think just expanding the social media presence, I think expanding the online presence, and I think, just simply expanding the amount of vendors, the places where Spare Change News is available, won't just reach the younger population, but will reach, will reach everyone.
Right.
And that was one of the things that Vincent talked about. He wanted to see in 5 years, right? Just tons of new places throughout Cambridge, throughout Newton, throughout Somerville, throughout East Boston. And social media is great, and I think it will help, but the number one thing is just, get the paper in people's hands, I think.
All right, so Liam Greenwell, remember that name. I expect great things from this young man as he moves forward in his career. Thank you so much for being on Spare Change News.
Thank you so much for having me,
And Liam has also been behind the scenes with the TV show, so it's great to have